Hello, this is Cheryl, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the February 3rd issue of the Washington Post on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the headlines, House votes to end government shutdown, buy time for ICE talks. The Department of Homeland Security will be funded through February 13 to allow for bipartisan negotiations over immigration enforcement. By Riley Begin and Kadia Goba. The U.S. House passed a set of spending bills Tuesday that will end the partial government shutdown while buying time for partisan negotiations over new accountability measures for immigration enforcement. The measures now go to President Donald Trump to sign into law and reopen the government. The agreement kicks off a 10-day sprint for Republicans and Democrats to agree on policy changes to how immigration and custom enforcement agents operate during immigration raids. If they fail to reach a deal in time, the Department of Homeland Security, including the Transportation Security Administration and the Federal Emergency Management Agency, would shut down on February 14. ICE and the agency's other immigration efforts would continue to operate due to the $170 billion appropriated for Homeland Security under the Republican tax and spending law passed last year. ICE and the Department of Homeland Security need to dramatically change, House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, Democrat, New York, told reporters Monday. And absent that, then a full-year appropriations bill is in deep trouble. The vote was 217 to 214. House Democrats pledged not to help House Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican Louisiana, kick off the process of considering the legislation, though 21 voted for the final bill Tuesday afternoon. 21 Republicans, meanwhile, voted no. A procedural vote to advance the bill package narrowly passed the House 217 to 215 earlier Tuesday, with all present Democrats voting no and all but one Republican, Representative Thomas Macy, Kentucky, voting yes. The vote was nearly derailed by last-minute opposition from a few Republicans, who ultimately acquiesced after more than 30 minutes of arm-twisting by House GOP leaders. "We'll handle it. We're going to pass the new rule today. It was never in doubt," Johnson told reporters Tuesday morning. "The Republican Party is sticking together because the stakes are so high." The more than $1.2 trillion package funds the Pentagon, the Departments of Labor, Treasury, Health and Human Services, Education, State, and more through the end of the fiscal year on September 30th. It also temporarily funds the Department of Homeland Security through February 13 in hopes that lawmakers can negotiate new oversight policies for immigration agents, the result of a deal struck between Senate Democrats and the White House after immigration officials shot and killed Alex Preedy in Minneapolis last month. The Senate passed that deal on Friday, but portions of the government shut down early Saturday morning because the House was out of town and couldn't approve it yet. Some House conservatives initially signaled that they plan to oppose the package, in part because they believe the agreement undermines ICE's efforts. Republican Anna Paulina Luna, Republican Florida, said she would not vote for it unless it included the SAVE Act, a bill that would require proof of citizenship to register to vote. But Luna visited the White House on Monday and said she and Representative Tim Burchett, Republican Texas, would join the rest of the party in advancing the legislation, saying she believes there is a path forward for the voter ID legislation in the Senate. Representative John Rose, Republican Tennessee, initially voted against the rule over the SAVE Act, arguing the bill belongs on must-pass legislation like the funding bill. He later changed his vote. President Donald Trump posted on social media Monday urging members to support the agreement. "We need to get the government open, and I hope all Republicans and Democrats will join me in supporting this bill and send it to my desk without delay. There can be no changes at this time," Trump wrote Monday. "We will work together in good faith to address the issues that have been raised, but we cannot have another long, pointless, and destructive shutdown that will hurt our country so badly, one that will not benefit Republicans or Democrats. I hope everyone will vote yes." The whole federal government closed for 34 days last fall, the longest shutdown in U.S. history, as Democrats sought unsuccessfully to extend health care subsidies that expired at the end of the year. House Democrats are split on the Homeland Security funding bill. Many have privately raised concerns that Senate negotiators won't be able to achieve meaningful accountability measures, and some have said they would prefer if ICE is not funded this year, noting that the agency received $75 billion from last year's Republican tax and spending law. ICE would also be able to continue operating if it isn't funded, drawing on that money. It does nothing to provide public safety at a time when communities are feeling under assault, said Representative Stephen Horsford, Democrat, Nevada, who plans to vote against the funding package. It doesn't have to be this way. This was a choice because the Republicans gave DHS a $200 billion slush fund with no accountability, no transparency, and instead of working with us to put those public safety guardrails in place, they've just chosen to bury their head in the sand. Others say keeping the agency funded for a short time is necessary if Democrats hope to achieve their goals of reining in ICE. I'll take those 10 days and see what we can get. And if at the end of those 10 days we can't decide to go with it, then it's a no vote, and the Department of Homeland Security is shuttered, said Representative Rosa DeLauro, Connecticut, the top Democrat on the House Appropriations Committee, adding that other funding bills are good bills with good things for the people we care about. Lawmakers will now turn to negotiating potential accountability measures for immigration officers. Senate Democrats have demanded that Republicans agree to require that immigration agents wear body cameras and identify themselves, get warrants for arrests, and adhere to a code of conduct similar to state and local law enforcement. House Democrats unveiled a similar list of demands on Tuesday, adding that immigration officers need clear guidelines for use of force. We have some opportunities to make our voices heard in the 10 days, said Representative Pete Aguilar, California, chair of the House Democratic Caucus. We have a list of what we want done, and we aren't settling for half measures. And if Leader Thune and Speaker Johnson don't want to come to the table and negotiate real reform, then they're going to have to explain to the American public why they're shutting down agencies. But Republicans have already rejected some of Democrats' core demands. Johnson said Tuesday that the conference won't agree to require judicial warrants for arrests by immigration officers. Administrative warrants are sufficient legal authority to go and apprehend undocumented immigrants, Johnson said. If someone is going to be apprehended and they run behind a closed door and lock the door, what is ICE supposed to do at that point? Oh, gee whiz, a locked door? Representative Lisa C. McClain, Michigan, chair of the Republican Conference, told the Washington Post that House Republicans do not intend to bend to Democratic demands that the party considers dangerous for immigration officials, such as requiring immigration agents to show their faces during raids. They're like a spoiled child that's not getting what they want and throwing a temper tantrum in the middle of the grocery store, she said of Democrats. You don't reward them with giving them a candy bar. Mariana Sotomayor contributed to this report. And continuing from the headlines, U.S. shoots down Iranian drone that approached aircraft carrier. Officials said the aircraft was acting aggressively when it approached the USS Abraham Lincoln, which was sent to the Middle East amid renewed tensions between Washington and Tehran. By Alex Horton and Dan Lamothe. U.S. forces shot down an Iranian drone approaching the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln in the Arabian Sea, officials said Tuesday, an escalatory move as Washington floods the region with military hardware amid renewed tensions with Tehran. The incident occurred about 500 miles from Iran's southern coast. U.S. officials identified the drone as a Shahed 139, a variant in a class of one-way attack drones that crash into targets and detonate onboard explosives. It was flying with unclear intent and approached the carrier despite U.S. personnel using unspecified de-escalatory measures, according to Captain Tim Hawkins, a spokesman for U.S. Central Command, which oversees military operations in the region. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt told Fox News the drone was acting aggressively when it approached the carrier. An F-35C fighter jet shot down the drone, Hawkins said. No American personnel were injured and no equipment was damaged, Hawkins said. The U.S. military has deployed dozens of aircraft to bases operating near Iran and assembled about 12 warships in or near the Middle East over the past month for what President Donald Trump has described as a pressure campaign to reach a new deal aimed at restraining Tehran's nuclear program. It is unclear whether U.S. forces attempted to contact Iranian counterparts to deconflict before the shootdown. An Iranian drone carrier has transited the Strait of Hormuz in recent days. Hours after the incident, Iranian vessels, joined by another drone, harassed a U.S.-flagged and U.S.-crewed tanker, the MV Stena Imperative, and threatened to board and seize it, Hawkins said. A nearby guided missile destroyer, the USS McFall, intervened and escorted the ship to safety under defensive air support provided by the U.S. Air Force, de-escalating the situation, Hawkins said. Iran's unnecessary aggression near U.S. forces, regional partners, and commercial vessels increases risks of collision, miscalculation, and regional destabilization, he said. It is unclear whether that separate incident was retaliatory or otherwise in response to the drone shootdown, but Central Command warned Tehran on Friday to operate with restraint as Iranian forces launched scheduled training exercises in the region. The drone encounter was reported earlier by Reuters. Iranian officials could not immediately be reached for comment. Earlier Tuesday, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian said on social media that he had instructed Iran's Ministry of Foreign Affairs to pursue fair and equitable negotiations with the United States, guided by principles of dignity, prudence, and expediency. He did so, he wrote, with the caveat that suitable environment must exist, free from threats and unreasonable expectations. The drone incident occurred after the U.S. military has spent weeks building up its forces in the region in response to Trump's open threat to attacking Iran. He reconsidered amid concerns that the U.S. did not have adequate defenses in place at the time that would be needed to respond to a counterattack. Trump then ordered the Lincoln and 3 accompanying destroyers from the South China Sea to the Middle East. They arrived last week. Other warships, aircraft, and air defenses also have arrived in the region, defense officials have said, though the Pentagon still has a smaller military presence in the region than it did last year when Trump ordered airstrikes with B-2 bombers on Iran's nuclear program. Susanna George contributed to this report. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Washington Post on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Continuing from the headlines, Pentagon warns scouts to restore core values or lose military support. The relationship dates back decades, but Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has criticized the organization for allowing girls to join and changing its name from Boy Scouts. By Tara Kopp and David O'Valley. The Pentagon issued a warning late Monday to Scouting America, formerly known as the Boy Scouts, saying the organization risks losing its long-standing partnership with the U.S. military unless it rapidly implements core value reforms. The public warning, delivered on social media by Pentagon spokesman Sean Parnell, comes just months before thousands of scouts are expected in West Virginia for National Jamboree, a once every 4 years camping summit that relies on hundreds of National Guard and active duty service members for medical, security, and logistical support. A sudden loss of that support could jeopardize the youth gathering. The organization has been in Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's crosshairs for years, ever since the group allowed girls to join, and in 2024 said it would rebrand as Scouting America to to project its inclusiveness. Hegseth is an avowed critic of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and has worked aggressively during his tenure atop the Pentagon to purge what he calls woke programs and people from the institution. The Pentagon in recent days has begun finalizing plans to end all support for the Scouts, seeking input from the National Guard and the military's active duty components on the potential impact of such a move, said multiple people familiar with a draft memo detailing the plans. If Scouting America does not comply with Hegseth's demands, which have not been made public, the group could also lose its access to military facilities, which would have a disproportionate impact on military children who participate in scouting troops at U.S. bases overseas, people familiar with the matter said. Like some others interviewed for this report, they spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss the Pentagon's deliberations. In his post to social media, Parnell said that after a review of the organization, the Pentagon is near a final agreement whereby it would continue supporting the organization because Scouting America has firmly committed to a return of core principles. Back to God and country immediately, Parnell wrote, assailing what he called Scouting America's unacceptable decisions in recent years that run counter to the values of this administration, including an embrace of DEI and other social justice, gender-fluid ideological stances. It was not immediately clear what changes the Scouts might agree to, including whether the organization would return to being for boys only. Neither the Pentagon nor Scouting America addressed questions seeking details on the scope of what it would require of the group. For nearly 116 years, Scouting has stood as a cornerstone of American ideals, good citizenship, service, and adventure for American youth. We are encouraged by tonight's social media post by the Pentagon, and we look forward to providing more details as we move ahead, Scouting America said in a statement to the Washington Post late Monday. Pentagon Press Secretary Kingsley Wilson said the Pentagon would have more to announce soon. Left uncertain is the fate of this year's Jamboree, a massive 10-day summit scheduled for July and expected to draw more than 15,000 Scouts from throughout the country to West Virginia. In the past, upward of 500 National Guard personnel, military reservists, and active duty service members have provided a range of equipment and logistical support for the event, all now in doubt if the organization does not meet the Pentagon's demands. They are on the clock, Parnell wrote on social media, and we are watching. Scout troops spend years planning and raising money through popcorn sales and other fundraisers to travel to the Summit Bechtel Reserve for Jamboree. A spokesperson for Scouting America did not answer questions about what would happen to the summit if military support is pulled, saying in a statement that the West Virginia National Guard, which leads the Defense Department's involvement in Jamboree, has indicated that they are fully prepared to support the event. In a statement, the West Virginia National Guard said that no official communication has been disseminated to us that would contradict or cease ongoing preparations, and that for now, military officials are planning to support Jamboree. Since becoming Defense Secretary a year ago, Hegseth has moved aggressively to purge the military of DEI programs and to fire senior leaders whom he accused of being overly focused on them. He pushed out transgender service members too, referring to them as dudes in dresses, and directed the military's service academies to get rid of books, student organizations, and courses that in his estimation were woke. Threats to sever the Defense Department's ties with the Scouts appear to be the latest evolution in this broader, highly politicized campaign. NBC News and NPR have previously reported that the Pentagon was considering cutting ties with the Scouts. In November, when NPR disclosed the draft memo's existence, Scouting America released a statement emphasizing that it has always been nonpartisan. Over more than a century, it continues, we've worked constructively with every U.S. presidential administration, Democratic and Republican, focusing on our common goal of building future leaders grounded in integrity, responsibility, and community service. A dissolution of the two entities' partnership would end what for many decades has been a mutually beneficial relationship, as a significant portion of the nation's military officers have scouting backgrounds, according to the organization. It would mark a shift for Hegseth boss, too. During his first term in office in 2017, President Donald Trump appeared at Jamboree and told the thousands of assembled scouts how proud he was to be there, and that 10 of his cabinet members at the time had been scouts. The scouts, Trump said at the time, believe in putting America first. A year later, the organization began admitting girls. The rebrand of Scouting America was announced in 2024 as the organization worked to move beyond decades of scandals involving sexual abuse allegations made by thousands of scouts who say they were abused by scout leaders or volunteers. As a Fox News commentator then, Hegseth said allowing girls to join and then renaming the Scouts was basically the end of the group, and he blamed the left for the change. They didn't want to improve it. They wanted to destroy it or dilute it into something that stood for nothing, Hegseth said on Fox and Friends. The Scouts' interconnectedness with the military is reflected in Army and Air Force policy, which says that service's most junior enlisted members, known as E1, can be automatically bumped up to the next higher pay grade if they join, having previously earned the rank of Eagle Scout. In the Navy, attaining Eagle Scout allows an enlisted member to jump from the rank of E1 to E3. The Scouts have served as a sort of feeder program for the military's service academies, too. According to Scouting Magazine, in 2017, about 20% of cadets at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point had attained the rank of Eagle Scout. At the U.S. Naval Academy for the class of 2020, about 17% of male midshipmen had participated in scouting. It was not immediately clear how many current cadets or midshipmen have scouting backgrounds. Spokespeople for the academies referred questions to the Pentagon. The relationship between scouting and the Pentagon is codified in law, too. Title 10, Section 2554 of the U.S. Code authorizes the Defense Secretary to provide all the support the Scouts might need at Jamboree, such as cots, flags, and refrigerators, to the extent that it will not interfere with the requirements of military operations. It also states that the Pentagon must seek a waiver from Congress if the military intends to cut its support, and explain why giving that assistance would be detrimental to the national security of the United States. Spokespeople for the House and Senate Armed Services Committees did not immediately respond to requests for comment. Mariana Alfaro contributed to this report. In a Washington Post exclusive, Homeland Security is targeting Americans with this secretive legal weapon. In October, a retiree emailed a DHS attorney to urge mercy for an asylum seeker. Then DHS subpoenaed his Google account and sent investigators to his home. From the Philadelphia suburbs. He had decided that the America he believed in would not make it if people like him didn't speak up. So on a cool, rainy morning in the suburbs of Philadelphia, John, 67 and recently retired, marched up to his study and began to type. He had just read about the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's case against an Afghan it was trying to deport. The immigrant, identified in the Washington Post's October 30 investigation as H, had begged federal officials to reconsider, telling them the Taliban would kill him if he was returned to Afghanistan. Unconscionable, John thought as he found an email address online for the lead prosecutor, Joseph Dernbach, who was named in the story. Peering through metal-rimmed glasses, John opened Gmail on his computer monitor. Mr. Dernbach, don't play Russian roulette with H's life, he wrote. Err on the side of caution. There's a reason the U.S. government, along with many other governments, don't recognize the Taliban. Apply principles of common sense and decency. That was it. In 5 minutes, John said, he finished the note, signed his first and last name, pressed send, and hoped his plea would make a difference. 5 hours and 1 minute later, John was watching TV with his wife when an email popped up in his inbox. He noticed it on his phone. Google, the message read, has received legal process from a law enforcement authority compelling the release of information related to your Google account. Listed below was the type of legal process, subpoena, and below that the authority, Department of Homeland Security. That's how it began. Soon would come a knock at the door by men with badges, and for John, the relentless feeling of being surveilled in a country where he never imagined he would be. John read the message a second time, then a third. He didn't tell his wife right away, worried she would panic. It could be fake, he thought, or a mistake, or maybe he feared it had something to do with that 4-sentence email he'd sent a prosecutor for the federal government. Google hadn't provided him a copy of the subpoena, but it wasn't the conventional sort. Homeland Security had come after him with what's known as an administrative subpoena, a powerful legal tool that, unlike the ones people are most familiar with, federal agencies can issue without an order from a judge or grand jury. Though the U.S. government had been accused under previous administrations of overstepping laws and guidelines that restrict the subpoena's use, privacy and civil rights groups say that under President Donald Trump, Homeland Security has weaponized the tool to strangle free speech. For many Americans, the anonymous ICE officer, masked and armed, represents Homeland Security's most intimidating instrument, but the agency often targets people in a far more secretive way. Homeland Security is not required to share how many administrative subpoenas it issues each year, but tech experts and former agency staff estimate it's well into the thousands, if not tens of thousands. Because the legal demands are not subject to independent review, they can take just minutes to write up, and, former staff say, officials throughout the agency, even in mid-level roles, have been given the authority to approve them. In March, Homeland Security issued 2 administrative subpoenas to Columbia University for information on a student it sought to deport after she took part in pro-Palestinian protests. In July, the agency demanded broad employment records from Harvard University with what the school's attorneys described as unprecedented administrative subpoenas. In September, Homeland Security used one to try to identify Instagram users who posted about ICE raids in Los Angeles. Last month, the agency used another to demand detailed personal information about some 7,000 workers in a Minnesota health system whose staff had protested Immigration and Customs Enforcement's intrusion into one of its hospitals. There's no oversight ahead of time, and there's no ramifications for having abused it after the fact, said Jennifer Granick, an attorney for the American Civil Liberties Union. As we are increasingly in a world where unmasking critics is important to the administration, this type of legal process is ripe for that kind of abuse. Since the start of Trump's second term, the ACLU has repeatedly heard from people whom Homeland Security targeted with administrative subpoenas, the organization says. It's taken on 3 of those cases, but none of them, its attorneys say, illustrate how the agency has exploited that legal power better than John's. This subpoena was part of a criminal investigation, Assistant Secretary Tricia McLaughlin said in a statement, noting that Homeland Security Investigations has broad administrative subpoena authority under the law. McLaughlin didn't say who was under criminal investigation, and the agency didn't answer questions about John's case or its broader use of administrative subpoenas. In his living room on that fall day, John tried to make sense of the email. He attended a No Kings rally last year, he said, and sent a few notes of criticism to lawmakers and maybe one to Trump's administration during the president's first term. But John, who worked in insurance, had never been arrested or questioned, he said, and his messages were written in the same moderation he displayed in the email to Dernbach, whose address he'd easily found on Florida's Bar Association website. John, who asked that the Post withhold his last name out of fear for his family's safety, followed a link in the email that led him to a form letter. Google didn't tell John what information the government officials wanted, but to keep them from getting it, he would have to file a motion in federal court and submit it to Google within 7 days. John's heart thudded in his ears. He felt sick. Unsure of what to do, he told his wife. "This is crazy," she said. "How can our government be doing this?" Born in England to a Jewish family, he grew up hearing the story of how his mother, at 20, joined an intelligence service amid the Holocaust to help Britain fight the Nazis. In 1978, while he studied law and politics at Cardiff University in Wales, he organized a protest of the Soviet Union's oppression of Jews, and he later traveled to the country to visit families who'd been ostracized. During a stay in Israel, he demonstrated against the movement to resettle the West Bank. In the mid-1980s, he supported mine workers in their bitter dispute with British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. It was around then that John fell for a girl from Philly, and in 1989 he moved with her to Pennsylvania to raise a family half an hour from Independence Hall, where the U.S. was founded. A year later, John watched President George H.W. Bush sign the Immigration Act of 1990, a bill that the Republican praised for recognizing the fundamental importance and historic contributions of immigrants to our country. John applied for citizenship a few years later because this was his home now and he wanted to vote for the people in charge of it. He admired nothing more about the U.S. than the Constitution he'd studied before swearing his oath of allegiance. The rights it guaranteed made the country unlike any in the world, John thought, and he was proud to be part of it. Now in his 27th year as a citizen, he was staring at his phone, terrified that the same country was trying to strip him of those rights. John needed help, so a day or two after he received the email from Google, he called Judy Bernstein Baker, who, at 80, remains one of Philadelphia's most well-known immigration lawyers. She was willing to offer advice, she told him, but first she needed to see the subpoena. "They didn't send me the subpoena," John explained over the phone. "How do you challenge a subpoena you don't have a copy of?" she asked. Worse, he told her, Google had given him a single week to file a motion to quash the government's demand. "Unless you're rich," Bernstein Baker recalled thinking, "nobody can find an attorney to go to federal court in 7 days." John assumed this subpoena had been approved by a judge or grand jury because he didn't know any other kind existed. But when he called the federal court district mentioned in Google's notice, a clerk told him they could find no trace of it. John pored over Reddit posts and old news coverage, eventually working out on his own that the subpoena was not judicial but administrative. The U.S. government has issued such subpoenas for decades, but their use expanded and became more controversial after the September 11, 2001 attacks. A vast range of agencies, from the FBI to Labor Department, can deploy them for specific types of investigations. Proponents describe administrative subpoenas as critical tools that allow investigators to avoid protracted judicial reviews to obtain information that could, for example, help them identify someone sexually exploiting a child or track down a suspected drug trafficker. Speed is what makes them so useful, former and current federal investigators told the Post. With no external bureaucracy, the government can obtain phone, financial, and internet records in days. Detractors argue that the lack of independent oversight and the secrecy with which they can be wielded threaten core democratic principles. This vast administrative power has remained opaque even to those who receive these subpoenas and invisible to those it affects most, Lindsay Nash, a professor and researcher, wrote for the Columbia Law Review last year. For John, discovering the nature of his subpoena made it no easier to obtain. Google had notified him from a no-reply address and directed him to request a copy from Homeland Security, but didn't provide a phone number. John's efforts to reach the agency led to a maddening, hours-long circuit of answering machines, dead numbers, and uninterested attendants. "It's a rigged process designed to keep people in the dark," John wrote an attorney at a nonprofit in California that offered him basic guidance. Google did not answer questions from the Post specific to John's case or explain why it gave him only 7 days to respond to a subpoena it didn't provide. The company is not required by law to inform users of government requests, but a spokesperson said it does unless it's legally prohibited from doing so or in exceptional circumstances, such as when someone's life is in jeopardy. Google can extend the 7-day deadline, the spokesperson said, though in John's case, the company never told him that or provided a way to request more time. Like other large tech firms, Google regularly publishes transparency reports that show how many government demands for user data it receives, but the companies don't differentiate between judicial and administrative subpoenas, despite their fundamental differences. Both Google and Meta received a record number of subpoenas in the U.S. during the first half of last year, as Trump began his second term in office, according to the company's most recent reports. Google, which has shared subpoena data since 2012, was sent 28,622, a 15% increase over the previous 6 months. Meta, Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, and Snap say that they, like Google, alert their users to administrative subpoenas unless they're barred from doing so or in extenuating circumstances. T-Mobile and TikTok, in contrast, say they notify users when required to by law. Verizon and AT&T wouldn't tell the Post whether they provide any notice, and X did not reply to questions. John kept searching for answers as Google's deadline passed. In the case of Instagram users posting about ICE raids, he read, the government dropped its case after the ACLU filed a 40-page legal challenge. In a similar case in Pennsylvania, Homeland Security asked Meta to identify people behind a Facebook and Instagram account that tracked ICE raids in Montgomery County. Federal attorneys argued in a court filing that the accounts invited scrutiny when they posted pictures of ICE agents' faces, license plates, and weapons. John Doe, through his social media accounts, is threatening ICE agents to impede the performance of their duties, the government told the judge in December. A month later, it withdrew the subpoena and the case was closed. Even if courts decide that Homeland Security abused its authority and violated constitutional rights, legal experts doubt the agency will be forced to stop the practice. The more John learned about administrative subpoenas, the more troubled he was that many Americans had never heard of them. After leaving England, he had fallen into insurance work, but he'd begun his career in British law, representing social workers from some of London's poorest neighborhoods. As he neared retirement, he signed up for a certificate program at Villanova University that trains people to help immigrants navigate a legal system that often feels overwhelming. Now here he was, struggling to navigate the same system. But John wouldn't let it go. He kept researching, calling, emailing. Obsessed, his wife said. Beyond my personal situation is the bigger question of how they misuse their powers to target innocent victims across the board, he wrote one attorney. If this goes unchallenged, we are all complicit or all vulnerable in allowing the government to abuse its powers. Through the window, his wife saw them coming. It's the police, she screamed. John hurried downstairs. It was about 9:30 on the morning of November 17. On his porch, he found a local officer in uniform with 2 men in slacks and sport coats. We're with Homeland Security, he recalled one of them saying. They showed him their badges. His breath quickened, but he tried not to panic. A diabetic now on Social Security, John stands 5'6", and the few remaining hairs on his head turned gray years ago. He speaks in a plodding British accent, and unless he's watching a Tottenham Hotspur soccer match, he almost never raises his voice. But he'd seen videos of Homeland Security encounters that turned violent, even for women, teenagers, and old men. Inside, he could hear the dog yelping and his wife shouting, "Don't you have anything better to do?" One of the federal agents showed him a copy of the email to Dernbach. "We want to hear your side of the story," he recalled one of them saying. He told the men about the Post's investigation and his dismay over Homeland Security's attempt to deport the Afghan who'd supported the U.S. war effort. When they asked how he knew Dernbach's email address, John, whose only social media is Facebook, told them he found it through a basic Google search. He also shared the notice from Google, which he said it seemed they had not seen. Someone from Homeland Security's headquarters in Washington had told their office to interview John, the men shared, though they didn't give a name. His message to Dernbach, he told them, was an opinion protected by the First Amendment. This is as mild as one could possibly interpret, he recalled saying. The investigators agreed that the email broke no law, he said, but they pointed to his mentions of Russian roulette and the Taliban. Perhaps, they conjectured, the prosecutor felt threatened. That was absurd, given the context, John thought, but he didn't say that. After about 20 minutes, the men thanked him for his time. But John had one more question. He sometimes returned to England to visit his family, and he and his wife had planned to travel over Christmas to Puerto Rico for their 40th wedding anniversary. I hope this doesn't mean I'm going to get stopped at the airport, he said. Am I on a list now? Of course not, he said, the men told him. He had nothing to worry about. An online privacy expert gave John a little-known email address he could use to request the subpoena from Google, though the guy warned him he might not get a response. John tried anyway. That same day, November 21, a Post reporter contacted Google about his case. 2 hours after that, 22 days after Google notified John of the subpoena, the company provided him a copy, though the name of the official who authorized it had been redacted. The investigators who questioned John told him Homeland Security couldn't obtain his emails, documents, photos, or other content with an administrative subpoena, he said, but the breadth of what the federal investigators did ask for shook him. Among their demands, which they wanted dating back to September 1, the day, time, and duration of all his online sessions, every associated IP and physical address, a list of each service he used, any alternative usernames and email addresses, the date he opened his account, his credit card, driver's license, and social security numbers. Then came another revelation 3 days later, when Google informed him that it had not yet responded to Homeland Security's legal demand. John had assumed Google provided the government everything it asked for weeks earlier, well before the agents visited his home. The company didn't explain the delay to John or the Post. Our processes for handling law enforcement subpoenas are designed to protect users' privacy while meeting our legal obligations, a spokesman told the Post. We review all legal demands for legal validity, and we push back against those that are overbroad or improper, including objecting to some entirely. The ACLU agreed to represent John pro bono, filing a motion to quash in federal court on Monday to prevent Google from ever releasing his information. His attorneys accused the government of violating the statute that limits the use of administrative subpoenas for immigration enforcement, and the organization argued that Homeland Security had violated John's right to free speech. It doesn't take that much to make people look over their shoulder, to think twice before they speak again, said Nathan Fried Wessler, one of the ACLU attorneys. That's why these kinds of subpoenas and other actions, the visits, are so pernicious. You don't have to lock somebody up to make them reticent to make their voice heard. It really doesn't take much because the power of the federal government is so overwhelming. The knowledge that Google never sent the government the information it requested both comforted and unnerved John because it meant that those two federal agents had tracked him down some other way. He'd noticed that on the subpoena's final page, the government had asked Google not to tell him about it. Any such disclosure, the message read, will impede the investigation and thereby interfere with the enforcement of federal law. Google had ignored that request too, and he was relieved, but it made John wonder, what if the U.S. government had investigated him in other ways, and what if it still was? One morning in early December, John shared his story with two acquaintances as they rode the train into Philadelphia for an interfaith protest unrelated to the subpoena outside ICE's field office. They don't have to go into court, John said of Homeland Security. They don't have to bother spending the money to do that. They just rely on the acquiescence of these companies to do their bidding. Clearly, they're doing it to further a particular agenda, Dave Mosenkis said from the seat in front of John. To intimidate, John interjected. That's what they want, said Rabbi Lee Wald, sitting next to Mosenkis. They want everyone to be scared, right? John thought back to how it all started with one note to Dernbach. There are no real safeguards anymore, he said, until people recognize that we are all potential targets. Mosenkis, 65, stared out the window into the morning sunlight, his eyes drifting across a city where he demonstrated against perceived injustices for more than 3 decades. I organized this weekly gathering, protest, he said, called We the People Wednesdays. The group took on a different topic each week: election integrity, defending the Constitution against domestic enemies, and wrote postcards to public officials. Their letters, Mosenkis realized, were no different from John's email. This is exactly the kind of thing we do, he said, and we tell people to sign their names and zip codes. He shook his head. He rubbed his forehead. If that's subject to surveillance, he said, then anything could be. The train soon pulled into the city, where they gathered in the cold with about 100 other people outside the ICE office. On the sidewalk, they listened to a rabbi recall the Torah's command to love the stranger. John waved signs that read, Stop ICE raids and Love thy neighbor. In the weeks that followed, he tried to turn his attention to the holidays and his anniversary trip with his wife. Just before Christmas, the couple left for Puerto Rico. At the airport outside San Juan, they waited at baggage claim until every other passenger had left. Their luggage, they were told, remained in Philadelphia. Is this a coincidence? He asked his wife. The bags arrived at their cruise ship later that night, and the couple opened them in the cabin. Nothing looked out of place in his wife's, but in John's he found a notice from Transportation Security Administration. Your bag, the standard form read, was among those selected for physical inspection. It did not explain why. John didn't want to talk about what it might mean, not then, so he took a photo, closed the bag, and tried to go to sleep. Drew Harwell and Nate Jones contributed to this report. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Washington Post on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. From the well-being section, why this nutrient is great for your gut health. Resistant starch helps protect against chronic diseases and has other health benefits. Here are foods you can eat to get more of it every day. By Anahad O'Connor. Have you had your resistant starch today? Nutrition experts say that resistant starch is one of the best things for your gut microbiome, the community of trillions of microbes that live in your intestine. That's because the microbes in your gastrointestinal tract convert resistant starch into compounds that reduce inflammation, lower your risk of chronic diseases, strengthen your overall gut health, and lower your blood sugar and cholesterol levels. But what exactly is resistant starch? If you're like most people, you've probably eaten it without even realizing it. Resistant starch is a cousin of dietary fiber. It's a type of starch found naturally in many plant foods, including beans, peas, lentils, nuts, seeds, green bananas, potatoes, and some whole grains. Even better, you can create resistant starch in rice, pasta, and a handful of other carb-heavy foods simply by cooking and then cooling them in the refrigerator. More on that later. Most starchy foods, such as white bread, bagels, and breakfast cereal, are quickly broken down and absorbed in your small intestine. But resistant starch resists digestion in the small intestine, which is how it gets its name. Instead, it travels to the large intestine, where it's metabolized and fermented by friendly bacteria and other microbes. The benefits of resistant starch. Your gut microbes have a symbiotic relationship with your body. When you feed them the foods that they love, such as fiber and resistant starch, they produce compounds called short-chain fatty acids. These special fatty acids increase satiety and help protect against inflammation, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and obesity. They also strengthen the lining of your digestive tract, which helps keep pathogens and toxins from entering your bloodstream and making you sick. Resistant starches are great for your blood sugar levels. Many foods with refined carbohydrates can spike your blood sugar because they're rapidly absorbed in the small intestine. But because resistant starches act like fiber, being mostly unabsorbed in the small intestine, they can actually reduce your blood sugar levels. One systematic review and meta-analysis of clinical trials published in 2023 found that regularly eating foods high in some forms of resistant starch improved blood sugar and insulin levels in people with type 2 diabetes. Nourishing your friendly gut bacteria with resistant starch causes them to thrive, which can end up suppressing the potentially harmful gut bacteria, said Mandy A. Patterson, a registered dietitian and an associate professor of nutrition at Texas Women's University who studies resistant starch. Resistant starch creates an environment where the bad bacteria can't thrive, she said. This changes the ecosystem of the microbiome in a positive way. It shifts the balance from potentially harmful bacteria to beneficial bacteria. Where to find resistant starch and how much you should eat. Experts say that adults should aim to consume 15 grams of resistant starch every day, but studies have found that the average American eats far fewer, just 4 grams of resistant starch daily. That's extremely low, said Karen Corbin, an associate investigator and the obesity program lead at Advent Health Translational Research Institute in Orlando. To add more resistant starch to your diet, here's a list of some common foods that contain relatively high amounts. The chart shows the amount of resistant starch in a 100-gram serving of each food. I'm going to read you some of these foods from this 25 common foods list. Grams of resistant starch in each 100-gram serving. Lima beans, 6.4. Ripe plantain, 5.1. Kidney beans, 3.8. Sourdough bread, 3.3. Russet potato, 3.1. Unripe banana, 2.8. Black beans, 2.7. Mixed grain bread, 2.6. And then it gets lower from there, which would include lentils, pinto beans, red potatoes, peas, ripe bananas, all coming in at about 1.8. And then pasta, durum wheat, millet, oatmeal, crackers, pumpernickel bread, and rice noodles coming in at 1 or lower. How to increase resistant starch in your favorite foods. Perhaps the best part about resistant starch is that you can boost the amount in some cooked foods simply by refrigerating them. When you cook starchy foods such as rice, potatoes, and pasta, and then cool them in the refrigerator, their starch molecules form tighter structures that become resistant to digestion. This process, known as retrogradation, can double or even triple the amount of resistant starch in these foods. In one randomized clinical trial, researchers analyzed the amount of resistant starch in 3 different preparations of white rice. They found that freshly cooked white rice had about 0.64 grams of resistant starch in a 100-gram serving. But white rice that had been cooked and then cooled at room temperature for 10 hours had roughly double the amount of resistant starch. And another batch of white rice that had been cooked then cooled in the refrigerator for 24 hours and eventually reheated had the most resistant starch, 1.65 grams per 100-gram serving. The researchers found that people had a much lower rise in blood sugar after eating cooked, refrigerated, and then reheated white rice compared with freshly cooked white rice. Other studies have found that cooking and then cooling or refrigerating potatoes, corn tortillas, pasta, black beans, pinto beans, and chickpeas can significantly increase their resistant starch content. Typically, the longer you refrigerate cooked starchy foods, the more their resistant starch content tends to increase. Cooked durum wheat pasta, for example, has about 1.2 grams of resistant starch per 100-gram serving, but after being refrigerated for a few days, the amount of resistant starch it contains nearly triples to 3.4 grams. One study found that cooked chickpea pasta had about 1.83 grams of resistant starch per 100 gram serving. But when it was cooked, refrigerated for 24 hours, and then reheated, the amount of resistant starch in the chickpea pasta had roughly doubled to 3.65 grams per 100 gram serving. How to eat more resistant starch. Aim to eat about 15 grams of resistant starch every day. But if you fall short of that goal, don't beat yourself up. If you're able to eat about 10 grams of resistant starch daily, for example, that's approaching the goal, and it's still more than double what the average American eats. Keep in mind that eating plenty of resistant starch can be surprisingly easy if you know what to do. Here are some steps you can take. Eat 2 to 3 servings of beans, peas, or lentils daily. 1 serving of beans, peas, or lentils is about half a cup. I would say beans and other legumes give you the most bang for your buck, Patterson said. I eat at least 2 servings every day. Corbin said, I hate using the term superfood because it implies that other foods are less good, but beans are a great source of plant-based protein and resistant starch. If you're not a big fan, then try mixing half a cup of beans, peas, or lentils into a salad or bowl of pasta with tomato sauce. You'll get plenty of resistant starch and you won't notice the taste. Eat baked potatoes. But after baking your potatoes, refrigerate them for at least 24 hours. This increases their resistant starch. You can cut them up and add them to salads, make a potato salad, or eat them alongside omelets, grilled salmon, or your favorite protein. I like to chill potatoes, especially Yukon Gold or red potatoes, Patterson said. I'll bake them and chill them, and then I'll put them in a salad cold as another way to get resistant starch. Eat overnight oats. Oats contain plenty of fiber and resistant starch, and just like pasta and potatoes, refrigerating oats after you cook them substantially boosts their resistant starch. And eat your grains. Whole grains like barley, millet, brown rice, and quinoa are a good source of resistant starch. Try combining them with beans for an extra boost of resistant starch. If you prefer white rice, that's fine, but try refrigerating your white rice for at least 24 hours after you cook it to increase its resistant starch. Eat nuts and seeds. Both contain a lot of resistant starch. Corbin recommends adding things like chia seeds, sunflower seeds, and sliced almonds to yogurt, smoothies, and salads. You can dump flax seeds and chia seeds in your yogurt or in your smoothie and you won't even notice it, but you're getting resistant starch. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the February 3rd issue of the Washington Post. Your reader has been Cheryl. Thank you for listening.